Wow, that was absolutely brilliant. Yes, make women count. How many of you are feeling righteous anger at some of those kind of figures? We all kind of, yes, absolutely. We're all really great. Thank you to both of you for doing that. Really appreciate the thought and care you've put into that. Apologies once again that we're having issues with the screen in terms of a kind of community venue. I'm afraid we couldn't quite stretch to kind of darkening this area with screens. So apologies for that, but we will circulate them and we will do that very quickly for all of you, okay? And now I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who I'm looking for in the room. There you are, fantastic. I am now delighted to introduce to you Dr. Emma Jackson of Glasgow Caledonian University. Emma is a community engaged researcher working within migration and works regularly across portfolios with Scottish Government ministers, civil servants and policymakers. And her demography work has built from the experience of those who are often marginalised by our systems of policy development and service provision. Her work is based in social justice and uses the authority and integrity of kind of the experience that she is involved in around community evidence in particular, which we'll focus on, and reflecting those experiences through research and how decisions are made. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Emma.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today to contribute to this important session on system change within policy making. And I think it's really right that I'm here because that actually has been the focus of my work for well over 15 years. In that time, Scotland's demography has fundamentally changed forever and continues to do so. The proportion of people of colour, of migrants out with the UK, coming from out with the UK, living in Scotland, has doubled in each census since 1990, reaching 12% in 2011. 21% of children at primary school in Glasgow in 2014 come from a migrant or a black and minority ethnic background. And Glasgow's overall population is expected to reach 19% by 2031. Long-standing communities of colour have been complemented in recent years by the arrival of migrants from EU and other countries, some of which are refugees and asylum seekers. These changes have broadly been welcomed by Scottish Government, which has a strongly pro-migration policy position. With Scotland's changing demography comes a diversity of cultures, perspectives, attitudes, and potential. When I first began working with these newly migrated to Scotland, I actually believed that the system of engagement with people's experiences would be able to accommodate these diverse perspectives. That has not proved the case. After about 10 years ago, I began to examine and investigate the system itself. Scotland's Community Empowerment Act 2015 recognised the need for a range of communities to do more for themselves and have more say in decisions that affect them. A range of civic initiatives have sought to enhance the voice and agency for different communities, including the Poverty Truth Commission, the Care Commission for Looked After Children, and the Gender Pay Equality within Policy and Service Planning. Despite the efforts of third sector organisations, the perspectives of people of colour in Scotland are often unheard or marginalised, with people of colour significantly underrepresented in decision-making fora, including public services, local authorities, and Scottish Parliament itself. My work as an academic is therefore with communities of colour in Scotland, long-standing, well-established communities, and the more recent migrants, those who often become racialised within society. When I say that I work with communities, I mean I actually position myself as an academic with them in the community organisations. I view the academy, the academic space, as having the potential to become an enabler, a conduit through which, if carefully managed, those who develop evidence through research for policy and practice decisions can be supported through the research process to engage with the people they are making policy about. I work at Glasgow Caledonian University, whose mission incorporates ambitions as working towards the common good. I have managed over the years within that organisation to navigate a place and a space for me to do this work. And that has been so important for the learning both about how to get that space and then what to do with it. I go to lots of meetings and get-togethers in the evenings, hear about people's hopes and their thinking, and engage with the huge expertise. And this isn't just obviously just about migrants, it's just I happen to be working with migrants, but the huge expertise communities have amassed to navigate, protect, and sustain themselves within this increasingly hostile environment. When I say hostile environment, I mean with the increasingly hostile environment generally towards black and brown people and those migrating, as well as the specific hostile environment department in Westminster, which has a serious effect on the day-to-day lives of people of colour and people who have migrated towards Scotland. This can be in accessing health and resources, irrespective that Scotland itself has taken a different stance, both policy-wise and narrative-wise. Immigration is still controlled by Westminster, and the effect remains situated in the everyday experience of people who have come here. And that is the intention of the hostile environment. So, what do? I work with communities to develop research projects and bids with them. These are often relatively small bids. There is little prestige about this in academic terms, yet doing this work together, we aim to demonstrate to those decision makers in policy and research and practice that the expertise communities can hold of the issues they experience is the knowledge and the expertise that needs to be incorporated in a much more authoritative and direct way into policy, research, practice, and service planning. I work in this way with communities in order to support not only those racialised, but as an academic to support the policymakers themselves in their work to gain traction with the decision makers, to encourage them, through evidencing the racialised people's experiences, to rethink the decision-making processes in organisations like Scottish Government, the NHS, local authority, and, at a time I might explain, our cultural organisations. So broadly, I work in migration, I work pragmatically across sectors, and so I engage with the cultural sector, the employability sector, health and education. And unsurprisingly, I find similarities in the experience of communities and people's racialised, irrespective of the sector I am working in and the policy process I employ to explore. The places and spaces to determine what is to be researched, what is the evidence, what is of value, whose story is universal, whose narrative becomes part of our public knowledge and processes, needs careful examination before we determine what it is we seek to understand. These are the decision-making spaces where people of colour, people of racialised, are often not represented. Their input is traditionally in focus groups with communities who can end up feeling co-opted into rubber-stamping research and policy protocols. In interview data, often that data collection is not even led by people of colour. The system does not often give the authority to those racialised to inform the decisions made about them. Migrants, communities of colour are completely over-researched, and yet there is so little understanding that the issues that affect them do so in a particular way because they are often racialised within the system. And that, in my view, is why I am here in this moment today. This, I would suggest, is a very small yet important part of the much wider global understanding about identity, about belonging, about rights represented in activist movements such as Me Too, Decolonising the Academy, Black Lives Matter, those demanding climate change action, and the myriad of small and large attempts across the world to rethink how we are engaging together. Whose voice is heard, when and in what spaces? Scotland, in the broadest context, in this particular moment, is attempting to reposition itself and to rethink these processes. It is spurred on, in my particular area, because of its particular stance towards Brexit, the EU, and of course wider Trump. And importantly, it is slowly beginning to own its own difficult emigrant history. All these factors contribute to our growing national narrative and our national understanding about ourselves as a country. I work a lot with policymakers and government officials in Scotland. In my view, we have relatively easy access, and as an academic, it is where I've positioned my efforts, because for the sorts of work I do, it is where the power and the influence to have conversations with those in power lies. So just quickly, some of the things to think about when you're rethinking policy and about policy coherence. What I've found is that often across sectors was that the only people not paid to attend, not paid to participate in research or evidence gathering were the very people we need to hear from, the community. So that needs serious attention and changes made in who is funded to participate, whose knowledge and expertise is valued, costed, and paid for. Community organisers are often experienced, are experts, but will rarely be given any recognisable status within the system or organisations they are speaking towards. And that needs careful management when seeking to engage together. The power differentials need managed in those spaces. And I have personally looked to the creative sector and developed mechanisms to support that. Within migration or research or policy development with communities of colour, we need to remain alert to the fact that the language we use around race and racism changes as our understanding changes, and that we need careful critical thinking about that language as it will impact on what we produce. Thinking about those racialized needs such careful critical thinking before we even begin these processes of developing policy. What I have found in my research and in my project work, as often there is some feeling as though this is the way it's sort of to be done, it's kind of sorted, and that's problematic. Like Angela mentioned there, for advisory group, we need to think of how that is structured around issues to do with representation of people of colour in Scotland and whether something similar can be put in place. Whose voice is heard, when and what spaces is central. Whose narrative is seen as universal, who is enabled to speak and be heard. Whose version of events is seen as valid for research. I have known all my academic career that I can easily get funding to problematize communities of colour. But getting funding to explore why that happens or what they, the community, wish to explore or implement as a solution is much more difficult. I wondered about just giving a sort of example of the end effect of not including, and just when in Scotland we're in this moment of re-looking at all these issues. I think many people, or most people hopefully, have heard of the policies around ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I don't know if you know that the effect, the original, when ACEs was developed, it did not include the experience of racism as an adverse childhood experience. And it was 10 years ago that the Philadelphia Urban Study first began to highlight the fact that for community of colour, racism was an obvious adverse childhood experience. So that has been addressed in that area of work. But the reason that that came about, I'm telling you about, is a sort of for you to reflect on how whole systems can be set up without including the perspectives of those who are not there at the decision-making table. So, this is a good moment when we're rethinking processes and policy system change to think carefully, bringing into the decision-making processes in ways that we can make ourselves first uncomfortable with and then comfortable with, is what I view as the task. And for the communities I work with, who are so very visible and yet often invisible in decision-making, I say to people here that migration forces change. That is the point. That is, in my view, the potential within it. And it is for us to work with it, not against it, and welcome that change and seek to understand and build from it all for all our benefit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. And I want to say thank you actually for your grace in acknowledging this moment, but also want to recognise that importance of all of us being willing to make ourselves uncomfortable to then move into greater kind of understanding around this. And this is something that I've personally kind of experienced as part of being part of the Advisory Council on Women and Girls, and why I was so delighted that you were able to kind of join with us today. It is so important, and that issue of policymakers engaging with those that their decisions affect, we've been hearing kind of constantly, but then when you kind of understand how poorly, particularly our kind of communities of colour, are served in Scotland around this, it's ever more important. Recognising the expertise that those communities hold, and that key question, whose story gets told?